All right. Chapter 22, second half of fourth period, continued. Apelles, Peregrinus, Marcellina, Philip, Soter, Montanus, and Tatian. Apelles, AD 160. Apelles is said to have been excommunicated by Marcion. He afterward had a sect and a gospel of his own. He was a Gnostic. There were various Gnostic sects. One of their cardinal doctrines was that Jesus was a man begotten by man. Some of them held that he became Christ, the Son of God, at the time of his anointing and baptism. When, says Baring-Gould, Gnosticism fixed on the anointing as the communication to Christ of his divine mission and messiahship, their mention of it was to cut out of the Gospels in possession of the church, and consequently the canonical Gospels are without it to this day. Others believed that Jesus and Christ were different, that Jesus suffered, but Christ only in appearance. These were called docetae. Christ, as distinct from the man Jesus, had a pre-existence. According to the fathers, Apelles denied the resurrection of the dead. He published a collection of revelations which he had received from a noted courtisan by the name of Philomene. Not much reliance is placed upon these assertions. They are considered slanders by Dr. Lardner and other candid historians. Especially are such statements against prominent women who held heretical opinions entitled to but little credit. Neander defends the character of Apelles and considers his intimacy with Philomene altogether blameless. The Gospel of Apelles. But little is known about this Gospel. Jerome, in the preface to his commentary on Matthew, and Venerable Bede, in his commentary on Luke, referred to the Gospel of Apelles as one of those alluded to in Luke. For inasmuch as many have taken in the hand to set forth, etc., Luke 1:1, according to these writers, then the Gospel of Luke was written in the latter part of the 2nd century. Peregrinus, AD 150 to 169. Lucian, an author of the Dialogues, AD 165, gives a history of Peregrinus. He says he learned a wonderful doctrine of the Christians by conversing with their priests and scribes near Palestine. And in a short time he showed they were but children to him, for he was prophet, high priest, ruler of a synagogue, uniting all offices in himself alone. Some books he interpreted and explained, others he wrote. They spoke of him as a god and took him for a lawgiver, and he honored him with the title of master. They still, therefore, worship the great man who was crucified in Palestine because he introduced into the world this new religion. Lucian was contemporary with Peregrinus, having been born in AD 124 and living until after 180. The same writer says further that Peregrinus was a person who rambled from place to place and from one sect of philosophy to another. Having been guilty of parricide and other crimes, he was obliged for a while to leave his native country and travel abroad. He was afterward imprisoned. While in prison, he was visited by Christians who administered to his necessities. The governor of Syria set him at liberty. He then returned to Parium, his native place, and afterward, about the year 169, he ascended a funeral pile which he had voluntarily prepared, and perished in the flames in the sight of all Greece. Peregrinus was also called Proteus. His death is mentioned by some of the fathers. Athenagoras refers to it as thus: of the statues of Alexander and Proteus, the latter, you are aware, threw himself into the fire near Olympia. That of Proteus is likewise said to utter oracles. There is reason to believe that the picture drawn by Lucian was like his portraiture of Alexander Abonotochus, and his casual mention of Apollonius of Tyana colored by the pen of prejudice. From other writers, there are more favorable accounts. Amanius Marcellinus, 3rd century, mentions his death and calls him an illustrious philosopher. Philostratus, 210, refers to his death and speaks of him as a cynic philosopher. Aulus Gellius, 2nd century, speaks of him as follows: I saw him when I was at Athens, a philosopher named Peregrinus, and surnamed afterwards Proteus, a man of dignity and fortitude who resided in a little cottage without the city. And as I used to go to him frequently, I heard from him many useful and excellent remarks, among which this is what I chiefly remember. He said, "A wise man would not be guilty of sin, although gods and men were alike ignorant of it. For he thought a wise man would avoid sin not from the fear of punishment or disgrace, but from his sense of duty and love of virtue." He then represents Peregrinus as quoting these lines of Sophocles. "Nor vanity think your skill can aught conceal. Time that knows all things shall all truths reveal." It is as difficult to reconcile this sprightly picture by the author of the Attic Nights with what is said by Lucian as it is to reconcile the extant epistles of Apollonius with the notice which Lucian chose to take of that philosopher. Marcellinia, AD 160. Marcellina was the founder of the sect called Marcellinans. She was a Gnostic, a disciple of Carpocrates. The fathers are almost entirely silent concerning her. If we are left in ignorance of desirable information, her name has at least been handed down free from detraction and calumny. Soter, AD 164. Soter was Bishop of Rome, about AD 175. Dr. Lardner puts him down as one of the writers of the 2nd century whose works are lost and dates his writings AD 164. He may have flourished as a writer before he was made bishop. Philip, AD 170. This writer is in the same category with the preceding. He is mentioned with Soter and others as writers of the 2nd century whose works are lost. Montanus, AD 170. Dr. Priestley thinks many of the Montanists were Unitarians. Epiphanius gives extracts from the writings of Montanus and shows him to have been a millenarian. Apollonius, the Christian writer of the 3rd century, became an active opponent of Montanism and endeavored to counteract the impulse which had been given to it by Tertullian. This great father had left the Catholic Church and had gone over to Montanism about the end of the 2nd century. Tischendorf says the opponents of Montanism rejected the Gospel of John. Epiphanius mentions the Papuzians, a sect of Montanists who permitted women to baptize. Tatian, AD 170. Tatian was by birth an Assyrian. He was converted by Justin Martyr, but afterwards became a Gnostic, a follower of Marcion. He joined the Encratites and has been considered by some as the founder of that sect. His oration against the Greeks is still extant. It contains no mention of any of the canonical Gospels. Some writers claim there are passages parallel with those Gospels. They consist of the sayings of Christ, and the better opinion appeared to be that they were taken from the Gospel of the Hebrews, the Gospel or Harmony of Tatian. There is a harmony of the Gospels attributed to Tatian. It is sometimes called the Gospel of Tatian. The work is first heard by Eusebius, who says, Tatian, however, their former chief, having put together a certain amalgamation and collection, I know not how, of the Gospels, named this the Diatessaron, which even now is current with some. The next reference of the Gospel of Tatian is by Epiphanius. He says, "It is said that he, Tatian, composed the Gospel by 4, which is called by some the Gospel of the Hebrews. It does not appear that either of these writers had seen any such gospel. They wrote from hearsay, and the statement of Epiphanius as to the name of the gospel is no doubt based upon the passage of Eusebius. The third writer is Theodoret. He says, he, Tatian, also composed the gospel which is called the Diatessaron, excising the genealogies and all the other parts which declare that the Lord was born of the seed of David according to the flesh. This was used not only by his own sect, but also by those who held the apostolic doctrines, who did not perceive the evil of the composition, but made use of the book in simplicity on account of its conciseness. I found myself upwards of 200 such books held in honor among your churches and collecting them all together. I had them put aside and instead introduced the Gospels of the 4 evangelists. The next century, Victor of Capua, referring to Tatian's gospel, called it diapente, the gospel by five. Such is the evidence concerning the gospel or harmony of Tatian. Let us attempt to analyze it. Epiphanius only states that it was then said that Tatian composed the gospel by four and immediately adds that it was called by some the gospel of the Hebrews. This was about AD 385, half a century later. Theodoret asserts that it was then called the Diatessaron and states something about its composition. Independently of Eusebius, then, it only appears that in the 4th and 5th centuries it was called the Diatessaron, and in the 6th the Diapente. But Eusebius says that Tatian himself called it the Diatessaron. This is not the first statement of Eusebius tending to give an early date to the canonical Gospels in which he is unsupported by earlier authorities. The importance of the question renders it necessary to examine into the credibility of the witness and to endeavor to ascertain whether his unsupported statement may be relied upon. This subject will be treated in the next chapter. In the meantime, there is a circumstance disclosed which in itself goes strongly to rebut the presumption that Tatian made use of the four Gospels. It appears that the testimony of Theodoret himself that he felt under the necessity of suppressing this Gospel, though it was held in high respect and 200 were in use in churches which he visited. The fact that Theodoret felt obliged to suppress it is inconsistent with the theory that it was harmony of the four Gospels and throws suspicion upon a statement made manifestly for the purpose of supporting such an inference. All right.